Stanford University.
Our speaker tonight, Dr. Mirsepassi, is a professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Sociology at NYU, and he directs what is now being called the Iranian Study Initiative. Although they're still an initiative, they're very active and keep seeing their programs, and so it's a very active initiative. I wish them great success. He has a bachelor's from Tehran University, and he graduated just, I think, a year before, or 2 years before I arrived there. He has a PhD in sociology from the American University. He has very successfully applied Western critical theory of the kind you all are familiar with to the experience of modernity in Iran. He's written extensively about this experience, and applying critical theory, he has come up with some very interesting results. Last year, I had the good fortune of using one of his books, Political Islam, Iran and Enlightenment, in one of my classes. And I knew then that we have to have him here and have everybody hear what he has to say. I asked him to kindly focus his talk on one of the enigmas of intellectual history in Iran, the marvelous Mr. Fardid. So I would let him introduce the marvels of the man called Fardid. Thank you for coming. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milani, for inviting me and for your very gracious review of my book. Of course, I enjoyed reading your review and sharing it with others. And thank you all for coming and being here, even if you don't turn off your phones. That's fine. I have to tell you that this is first time in my life that I'm doing a PowerPoint. And I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm a pretty old-fashioned person. Although for today, for instance, I've been actually working on this paper on Fardid since I finished the book. And I have a paper of about 60 pages, but I have to also, with my hand, write my notes and make sure that I can read my own handwriting and have a structure of the lecture. But, you know, I did this PowerPoint not really because of this fancy kind of thing. It's because I wanted to share with you some pictures at the end that are non-political and just hopefully fun. And since this is Stanford and, you know, we are academics, I just created some other things with it. But the main goal of having this PowerPoint is to show you some very recent pictures of Fardid's home that is a foundation now in Tehran, in case you haven't seen it. So don't worry about the PowerPoint. I want to make two comments about the title and subtitle of my talk. The Political Islam's Romance with the West is a title of a chapter of my book, Political Islam, Iran and the Enlightenment, which is a book that tries to make this argument that the scholars, at least the scholars in the West, in English-speaking West, have routinely underestimated what I call the non-Islamic elements of political Islam. The argument that I try to make in this book, in the book, is that almost all ideologues, or if you want a more neutral term, intellectuals of political Islam, at least in Iran, although my argument is that this goes by far beyond the Iranian nation state, at least in Iranian case, are extremely influenced by Western ideas in formulating their idea of the political Islam. The obvious cases are Ahmad, a former communist and a secularist who popularizes the notion of Gharb Zadagi from Ahmad Fardid. Shariati, who is a sort of a liberal nationalist member of the National Front, who go in Paris and becomes a born-again Muslim, and many others, including Fardid. And again, I don't think that my argument only applies to Iran, but for tonight, I want to focus on Iran. My argument in the book is that this has important and critical consequences. That if we don't understand what the nature of political Islam as an intellectual enterprise at this point, my focus is on political Islam as an intellectual force. If we don't understand where it comes from and what its intellectual elements are, which I believe for many actually eminent scholars that's to be the case, either we embrace it as representing the authentic Iranian or Islamic traditional way of life and praise it. I think people like Esposito, Ivan Haddad, and others who are scholars of Islam have and do that. They really see political Islam as representing the authentic traditional culture of the Islamic world, and our criticism of political Islam as inauthentic and illegitimate. Or you go to the other extreme and basically come up with what I feel is a self-defeating intellectual strategy that blaming every act that a political leader makes, say in Iran or in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or in Egypt, as representing the true Islam, and then you invite us to get rid of Islam. I think this is politically self-defeating, and I feel that is intellectually dishonest. So the political Islam romance with the West, I particularly want to focus on romance to say that it wasn't that these intellectuals in a marginal way were influenced by some ideas from the West. There was a romance, there was a serious engagement with romance. Fardid says, I am, and I'm going to use the Persian word for it, ham sukhane, a speech partner of Heidegger. He never said that about Prophet Muhammad or any other revered Islamic figure. He also said later on, I get into this, is that Fardid was ham sukhane Imam Khomeini, which is also very interesting. Heidegger was, Fardid said that Heidegger was ham sukhane Imam Khomeini. So one comment about the marvelous life and thought of Ahmad Fardid. As I said, I have been working on Fardid's project for a few months. After I published my book, I realized that I need to really look at this case. Because while I was writing that book, I just realized that there is very little about Fardid available. Or whatever is available are hearsays that people just say and just repeat. Or worse than that, on almost everything about Fardid, whether it's about his life and particularly his ideas, there are contradictory statements by people who claim to be there at the time. So I decided with the book, it's enough. I know enough to make the case. I don't want to devote a chapter on Fardid. But as I have been working on this, I just realized that marvelous is the only concept that I can use to describe him. And let me tell you what I mean by that. And again, this is very simple. If you just look at the dictionary, these are the meanings of marvelous. I'm using it in an obviously ironic way. On the one hand, it means hard to believe. Everything about Fardid is hard to believe. Causing great wonder. It really causes great wonder. Awesome and awful. This is particularly because I think Fardid is both awesome and awful. There are moments of brilliance and long moments of dark and brutal images that come to your mind when you read ideas that he expresses. It also means a strange, supernatural, and eye-opening. It is eye-opening. It is sort of supernatural, particularly if you don't understand what he says. Now, I have to say one more thing, and that is that, in a sense, we are lucky tonight that this lecture is in English. Because in Farsi, it's hard to understand what this guy is saying. In fact, translating him is almost impossible. I have had 2 graduate students helping me, but when I read this in English, it makes by far more sense than in Farsi. And this is known, obviously. Everybody knows that. But I don't think we have time. Maybe if you have time, I read something in Farsi to see that it's almost incomprehensible. There is no way that we can understand this. Now, I want to say something in parentheses. By the way, if you are into gossip, I don't think there is any other Iranian intellectual that you can spend 2, 3, 4 years on gossips and publish this, and I think this would be the most popular intellectual book that anyone has ever written about Fardid. There are so many gossips and rumors about him. I have actually tried not to include them, although I may mention some of them, because it's just hard to substantiate anything. And when I say this, for this research, I have contacted and interviewed some of the individuals who were, for instance, part of the Fardidiye group, some of his close students and associates post-revolution time, and many others, but still it's a wonder. You don't know whether he was influential in post-revolutionary or not at all. You don't know if he was an important figure in Fardidiye, the sole central figure or not. People have totally different views. That makes my job a little difficult, but please bear with me because I have to choose at some point one version over another. In question and answer, I would be happy to give you background information or tell you why I choose one version over another, but that's what you need to do. That actually starts with his date of birth. Fardid himself actually in different places gives different date for his date of birth. Aghay Ashuri, who I believe would be here soon, I think made a statement that early on he exaggerated his age so that he would be taken more seriously, and later on tried to say I'm younger. I have looked at some official documents, and we have decided for tonight's purposes that he was born in Yazd in 1909. I think this must be accurate because, as you will see later, we have his high school diploma and bachelor's degree and some other documents. They all have this. However, even in those documents, in most of them it says that he was born in Yazd, although in one of them it says he was born in Tehran. He was born in Yazd, although Ahmad Fardid was not his name, his real name. His real name was Sayyid Ahmad Mahini. Later on, when he moved to Tehran and he became a secularist and modernist intellectual, he changed his name. And of course, the only reason we know this is because he said so. There is no other information. So what I want to do is that to briefly, and I have to really be very brief, just share with you his life narrative, the marvelous life, and then explain some of his ideas. Is that okay? The way actually I have written the paper is that I have integrated both together, but unless I read the paper, I can't do that verbally. I have to say that most of the information that I share with you about his earlier part of his life are based on the only information we have about his early life, which is an interview he did with Mobedi, who had a TV show in Iran before revolution, but he was also a writer for Rastakhi's newspaper. So he interviewed him about his life, and this was published. Although there are different versions of this everywhere, and in many of these versions, nobody says that where the biography comes from, particularly in post-revolutionary Iran. His students and sort of official biography is always published without saying that this was an interview with Mobedi that was published in Rastakhi's. But there is no other documentation about his early life. I just assume that is true. There are serious reasons to think that he is a man who always bragged about himself, but I have no other information that would contradict it. So he was born in Yazd in 1909, which means that he grew up. His childhood basically happened during the early years of Reza Shah. What is strange is that repeatedly in several interviews he said that I'm a child of Mashrute, Constitution, and he said, well, when I was like in high school or in college, the intellectual environment was the intellectual environment of Mashrute, which is totally wrong, which it wasn't. But I think Fardid want to say that these two periods of times are the same. It is very interesting that when he was 12 years old, in 1921, his father sent him in Yazd to school and got a tutor for him to learn Arabic and French. This is a little unusual. He says his father was a farmer, but a little investigation shows that he's maybe father in terms of what in pre-Islamic Iran called dehqan. It seems that he comes from a pretty well-off family, and not farmer in a way that we understand it. Keshavars, he says, not Keshavars, but even for a well-off family, it is rather unusual that in the 20s, his father sent him to study, to learn these two languages. By the time he claims by the time he was 14 or 16, depending on which interviews, he claims to be able to read a scholarly text in both French and in Arabic. It's said that he had some kind of religious or maybe traditional education, although it's not clear. I have no evidence that shows that he really did any serious, what we call traditional education, but certainly he went through the regular education that everybody else goes on. By the time he's 16, he moves to Tehran and studies at Dar al-Funun. And he, now let me see if I can work with this. This is not necessary, but just to show off. Oh. I maybe, no, okay, I have to go one back. Anyhow, I wanted to show you his diploma from Dar al-Funun. Is it this?
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is. So he receives his high school degree from Dar al-Funun, and then he goes to Danisaray Ali. It's basically Iranian teacher college. Danisaray Ali, okay. And what is interesting that he gets his degree from Danisaray Ali. His major is, there are two lines of majors in almost everything, from French to philosophy to teaching and so on and so forth. So he had, French language was the first, general psychology, basic and history of philosophy, and ancient philosophy. That's very interesting because later on I never saw any degree like this. But his real love was learning languages. And he claims that by this time, by the time he graduated from Danisaray Ali, he knew German, French, Arabic, couple of ancient Iranian languages, and some Asian languages, Persian and Asian. I want to make a differentiation about this. Whether this is true or not, we don't know. It is, I will show you some pictures of his library. It is true that he obviously knew French, German, and Arabic, and read important first original texts in those languages. Whether he knew Sanskrit, Pahlavi, and other languages, he claims that he did. I just assume he did. But for him, knowing languages is very important philosophical experience. It's not just a way of accessing certain cultural and certain texts. He says, I think, he says, well, like I said in both languages, he said, زبان کجاوی بود که مرا به دورترین نقاط جهان میرسوند. Languages were a stagecoach that took me from Iran to the far distant places in the world. And this is very important. I will later come back to this. Now, in his 20s, he wrote the first article he wrote, which I may have it here, although it's hard to go back. He wrote a piece called From Kant to Heidegger. I would say that it is pretty amazing that for a 20-plus year old Iranian young man in the in the 30s to 40s and 40s to write that's it. To write this. This was published in Shabak al-Sorh, the newspaper that Taqizadeh published that. Is that true? Anybody? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He published basically 2 articles, 2 essays. This was supposed to be a series of essays. He only wrote 2 of them, from Kant to Heidegger, 1 and Kant to Heidegger 2. And then later he published another article called Bergson and Bergsonian Philosophy. That was published in Soha. I still would argue that this is a time that in Iran, Marxism was pretty strong among intellectuals, and positivism was really the dominant mode of thinking about Iranian intellectuals. But certainly, I think we can document this, that he was the first person who wrote about Heidegger, for instance, in Iran. But and this is at a time that it doesn't seem that anybody knew much about Heidegger. There are other evidence. For instance, Sadegh Hedayat, the Iranian novelist and intellectual, writes about Fardid that at times Fardid, he says, can be very brilliant, but he's a very strange man and can be also very stupid. But he says, well, Fardid gave me some books that are very interesting. It is interesting, and he named the books. When you look at these books, these are mainly books by Christian existentialists, philosophers, like Kierkegaard, Berlioz, and others. I think what I find interesting is that, and this is when this guy is in his early 30s or maybe late 20s, these are not the kind of books that Iranian intellectuals at the time would read. And in fact, Hedayat says that this seems a little strange, these are interesting, but I don't know what this guy is into. There is quite a lot we don't know about him. He was friend with Hedayat, and they would go to the cafes and would engage in intellectual discussions. One thing we know is that Hedayat said that, and a couple of others, at the time, that his strange behaviors. For instance, he would just interrupt a speaker and would interrupt the speaker in a way that an event like this would just stop and people would go home. He would go and knock on the podium with his shoes or something like that. There are evidence of those kind of behaviors that Fardid would engage in. Nothing about his political affiliations during this very political time. And now we are talking about the 40s. The only thing we know is that he was very close to Muzaffar Baghai. I'm sure that you know he was. Muzaffar Baghai, I haven't done any research on him. He claims to have a PhD in philosophy. I just assume it's true because I come back to this very hard. But he was also a very mysterious, a strange kind of person who was close to Mossadegh and betrayed him. And he is another phenomenon that if there is any PhD students here who is yearning for a topic, that's one. Now, I want to now go a little quickly and finish his life and get into his ideas. Then he leaves for France. He studies in Sorbonne for 3 years. Now, to tell you how horrible and difficult it is to research this guy, I have contacted every person in the world to see what he did at Sorbonne. I have nothing. Now, the closest I have come up with, a couple of my students have helped me, particularly one graduate student who went to Iran and interviewed several of his students. All they could tell us, most of them had no idea. One of them actually gave a title of his master's degree, which is on philosophy of intentionality. I don't know what it means, whether it's true or not. However, for instance, Aghay Ashuri thinks that he did nothing. He just murdered, got the scholarship, did nothing. I actually would argue that that cannot be true. Because for one, and I will show you this later, in his library, there are books in French that were published at the time. And also, I have this in this, although I don't know whether I can find it. There is a library card here. Doesn't necessarily mean much. But it shows that this is it. He is a member of the National Library in Paris. But other than that, we don't know. And those of you who know Iranian bureaucratic system, because once I spent almost a year in Iran, and my daughter, who at the time was third grade, I wanted my daughter to just sit in a class, informally. They asked for so many documentations that there was no way I could produce them. And they rejected her. It is amazing that Fardid could have received full scholarship without signing up in Sorbonne or anything, but we don't know anything. So he spent there for 3 years. And then he spent between 4 to 6, although some people also argue that 8 years. I think 4 to 6 is probably more accurate. Years in Heidelberg, in Germany. And here is that it seems to me that Fardid changes. Now, let me see if I can go back. Okay. Up to this point. So you see these quotes, one by him. He said, this is before he leaves for France. The verse struck me like a thunder. And his religion was burned. What else was burned? His belief was burned. And he became totally Westtoxicated. Although he didn't know what Westtoxication meant at this time. He was, well, and what Hidayat says is actually more interesting, right? So a big and dogmatic creature. This dogmatism is pro-Western dogmatism. And there are other evidence, I don't want to bore you with this. And also Hidayat actually says other things about, he really thought that a baggage handler in the West is more intelligent than an Iranian intellectual or cleric, as it says here. He was a totally pro-Western in its negative terms. And it is when he goes to France and Germany, particularly in Germany, that he changes. And this is one of the points that I am trying to make here. It's not that he went to Qom and met with Ayatollah, whoever, or wasn't even in Iran. Now, there are also rumors that he met with Heidegger. There is no evidence of that. there are evidence that Heidegger was there at this time, and this is now I think we are talking about 1988 to 55. He came back to Iran in 1955. We don't exactly know when he left France for Germany, but if he was there for 6 years, basically 49 to 55. But we do know that he studied Heidegger, this whole phenomenology tradition. However, again, what he did in Germany is even more mysterious than what he did at Sorbonne. Because at least I was able to get the title. We have absolutely no idea of what he did in Germany. He doesn't say in his interview. You probably know, I hope I don't assume, that he has students and associates who think he is God. And I have contact with them, and they don't know what he did. Isn't it strange? It is totally strange. By the way, he is a man who always brags about himself. I think I have this would take time. I have actually a page of his autobiography. He feels that he was a genius person. He says nothing, and we don't have anything. We have nothing. We don't know what he did. Everything that we say are just rumors. He comes back in 1955 to Iran. He comes back. Let me try to see if I can be very fast on this. He comes back. What is important here is these two periods of intellectual meetings, intellectual circles in the 60s and 70s that is usually known as Fardidiyya. These are a group of eminent Iranian intellectuals, not as eminent as your book, but the eminent among those eminents, who would get together mostly in Aghay Amir Hosseini Jahanbaglu house and would discuss things. Now, I thought, okay, this is not Sorbonne or Germany, and I know some of these people. I'm going to interview them and find out what happened. Zero. It is amazing. This is not about Jesus, whether Jesus existed or not. This is what happened in these meetings in the 60s and 70s. By the way, it's not that there were 20 years of these meetings. There was an interruption, but there were more than 10 years. Now, all the evidence we have that are produced by the revolution tells us that this was Fardid. Fardid was the central figure, and everything else, all the discussions went around Fardid's ideas. Who participated? And again, some participated in the earlier one, some in the later one. There is no time to say this, but Darush Shaiban was there. Nas sometimes was there and sometimes was not. Hamid Enayat, your colleague, was there. Aghay Jahanbaglu certainly was there. Davari was there. Aghay Jalili was there. Shahrukh Meskoob was there. I don't want to take your time, but more or less, except for Marxist intellectuals of the time like Aryanpur, or maybe very religious intellectuals like Mutahari or Shariati, these are both secular and religious-leaning eminent intellectuals of Iran, are there, and Fardid is at the core. Now, all the narratives, the stories after the revolution about these meetings are totally contradictory. And I have interviewed several of these people. Some people think that Fardid was a member, He just said a stupid thing about everybody laughed at him. Davari said that he was our God. You know, Ashuri and Shaidan who now claim that these were stupid meetings, they've attended every single meeting for 20 years. And they always praised him. I talked to Ramin Jahanbaglu. These meetings took place in his parents' house. He seems to be more fair, although he was only 15 years old. He said, well, it was Fardid, yeah, Fardid was at the center. Discussions were around Heidegger, Hafiz, localism, this kind of thing, which makes sense. And Jalili was sometimes critical of him. That also makes sense. And Meskuk would be sometimes critical, but he also said that everybody thought that he is the most brilliant man that Iran has produced. Now, I want to tell you something to say that there is some element of truth to this. Perhaps the most important critical piece about Fardid has been written by Aghay Ashuri. Right? Ashuri basically portrayed him as an insane, stupid, lazy, unethical, what else? Fascist person. Anti-Semite. Well, now, what is interesting is this. So this is Savaneh Hall. This is the interview. You see these titles also. He's just saying that I was born in this town, in this Savaneh Hall. This is the interview with Nobody, I don't know what I call it. Maybe. What did I want to show you? Oh, okay, I know. No. Well, Fardid, let me continue. I don't want this. Okay. Oh, no, I don't want this. Okay, don't worry. Fardid died in 1994. Right? So this is day after the revolution. It was clear to everyone, certainly clear to Iranian philosophers and intellectuals, who Fardid was. Fardid politically was very close to the sort of mysterious, sort of mafia-like, very ultra-conservative faction of the Islamic Republic, close to Kayhan. There were rumors that he was close. Actually, Saeed Imami was his student. Anybody knows who Saeed Imami was? The Deputy Minister of Information, or the Iranian Secret Police in charge of national security, is really the person who is more important than the minister. He certainly, some of the leading editors of Kayhan were close to him. He was a leading figure in trying to clean up Iran from Dr. Soroush and his students' ideas. And these are not rumors, these are things that he and others have said. So he dies in 1994. Right? The revolution happened in 1978. The signature of people who signed the obituary for him includes, and these are people in Iran, almost every single prominent intellectuals, philosophers of Iran. Includes from Jawad Tabatabai to Dinani to Shahidi to, the list has about 23 names, all extremely well known. point of view of saying that this guy was a stupid, misguided fascist, on the one hand, and some of these people have said this, and also praising him doesn't make sense. Secondly, at the same time, when he died in 1994, Aghay Ashuri wrote a piece about him. Anybody know how I can go back? Anyhow, I may not have this. I just summarize it to you. Ashuri in Nigah No writes an article. And Ashuri basically makes, I make 2 points that he makes. One is that with the death of Fardid, Iran lost the first modern philosopher of Iran. Actually, the translation is not good. He writes in Farsi, and he's a very good writer. It's more reverent than I'm telling you. And then he goes on to say that the most important issue in modern Iran is the crisis we have in our relationship with the West. And there is no one in Iran, in history of Iran, from Mashrute until now, who has been able to articulate this crisis than Fardid. Right? To be honest, he moderates his tone in part of this article by saying that, well, regardless of whether we agree with him politically or not, I know Darish Ashuri and certainly Darish Ashuri would not agree with him on his politics. But in terms of ideas, I think this piece is pretty praiseful. And then a few years later, he writes this piece that I cannot connect these two pieces. What I want to tell you is not about Ashuri. What I want to tell you is that I can give you 10 other examples of people who at the time, or at some time, praised this guy and then later totally dismissed him. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that part of this is political. I don't understand Ashuri's things because it's about 15 years after the revolution that he's saying this. But part of it, I think, is that it may be. This is something that I am not sure, but I think there are evidence of it, that in some respect, Fardid represents a particular generation of Iranian intellectuals, with all the good and ugly about them. Let me give you some examples. One, the fact that Fardid never wrote anything, which is true. The 3 articles that I told you, and these are really little essays, this is all he has written. I don't know whether I would even have time to get into his ideas, but there are several articles by his students in post-revolutionary time that I had to rely on them, and some interviews, to see what his ideas are. He never wrote anything. On the other hand, this is not, and he may be an extreme case. On the other hand, I just mentioned Hussein Aryanpur. That we always assumed that he was one of the great intellectuals in Iran. He also more or less never wrote anything. He translated a book. He had some, gave some lectures that became texts, but Aryanpur never did any research or any serious work. The person that we call the father of Iranian sociology, and somebody who politically I respect, Dr. Sadiri, absolutely never wrote anything. The father of Iranian sociology actually wrote an introduction to a book on Shahnameh. That's all. First of all, that's literature.
Aristotle.
Pardon me?
On Aristotle. Not on Shahnameh, on Aristotle.
Maybe, I'm sure that if I'm wrong on this. That basically has no sociological writings. Both of them, both Sadiri and Aryanpur, were in the business of coming up with translations of words, which is what all the Fardid's students are proud of, coming up with names such as Westtoxicated and others. And his degree there is all this controversy about, well, he never really had a PhD. We don't have time to go into that. The names of eminent Iranians who were in his situation, this was such a big routine in Iran that Tehran University had a particular commission of people who would get these folks and basically offer them PhDs. None of these are really unique to Fardid, right? So I think there is something bigger than that. And even with both Aryanpur and with Dr. Shariati about what they studied, what they said they studied, these are all problematic. Do we have a little time for me to get into some of these ideas, at least a bit? Yeah. Okay. Now, in fact, there is so much to say that I'm tempted to ask Dr. Milani to order some pizza so that we can sit here and talk about him. Now, my research is mainly based on several books, particularly one book that his students have published based on his lectures and his lessons. You know, we have to assume that these are true, but these are people who love Fardid and have produced these books. Extremely difficult to understand. Part of it is totally impossible to understand and goes on and on about things that not pertinent to anything. Right? That this is a start. Now, there are two controversies here that I want to reject. Iranian intellectuals' love affair with Heidegger is a long, long, long story. And most critical books about Heidegger, basically, from my perspective, are waste of time, saying that there is no relation between Heidegger and Fardid, or that Fardid did not understand Heidegger. To me, this doesn't make sense, because if there is one Iranian who should know Heidegger, is him. He wrote about them, he studied in the same university that he had some presence, he knew German, and he claimed that he was Hamsukhane Heidegger. Heidegger had some kind of love affair with fascism during the Hitler time. And Fardid had, some kind of love affair with the fascistic segment of the Islamic Republic. These are all kinds of things. And I also think that, I may not have time to get into that, there are strong evidence that even these invented ideas that he came with, and they look so strange, are based on Heideggerian philosophy. So I reject that. The other argument by his students and associates are that Fardid was never important. This is also another strange thing. We have interviewed many of his close students and associates, including Dabari. I'm sorry. Their claim is that Fardid was never important. This poor little man who never ever in Iran took him seriously, why is it that everybody is criticizing him? In fact, the latest one, my graduate students in April, when he interviewed several folks in Iran, and these are well-known people, but I don't want to give names. One of them said, well, ask Dr. Mirsepassi to go and criticize Dr. Soroush. He is in power in Iran, not Fardid. And actually, these comments have been made by others. I'm sure that Dr. Soroush, you know this. They still feel that it's Soroush in power in Iran. And these are people who are in pretty powerful places in Iran. So there are defensive or aggressively defensive, but they are always defensive in any areas of Fardid's life or thought. For instance, they all start saying that we know that he wasn't a real Muslim. Well, we know that Fardid would drink not necessarily water, stronger than water. We knew that he married a French woman, whose name we don't know, he never talked about that. Then he remarried. He forbid he has a son and a daughter. He didn't want them to study philosophy and encouraged them to leave Iran. 3 of them live in this country. A number of his main students actually don't live in Iran. These are all very interesting. And they deny that Fardid ever had any influence in Iranian politics. That's what you get from them. They also tried to say that he was not that much influenced by Heidegger, although he understood Heidegger very well. His ideas are genuinely his own. Now, there are 3 areas of his thought that are very important. I just try to say them in, give you a list of them. Fardid has this very strange view of history, which is, from my perspective, partly based on Heidegger's notion of being as a being. I come back to that. And Hegel's philosophy of history. Right? However, this guy who knows so many languages, this is how he argues the theory. That there are 3 historical periods in humanity, in human history. From the beginning to the future, the whole story. Each period represents a particular name of God, right? Because for Fardid, Ismul Asma is at the core of everything, right? This is where the batin, the essence, comes from, right? So his argument is, and Ashuri in his piece tries to say that this has nothing to do with Heidegger, it comes from Al-Arabi. It is true that he is somehow influenced by Al-Arabi, but I have searched and read hundreds of pages. There are very little, there are actually some references to Quran. You see that. Some to Al-Arabi, but mostly to Heidegger. So what are these historical periods? So there is obviously today and yesterday, and there is tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. These are 5, right? Or did I say all of them? There is Pariruz, Piruz, Emruz, Farda, và Pascha. Right? I'm not into this kind of thing. Right? No. Look. Pariruz, Diruz, Emruz, và Farda represent Taghut, represent the false God. Remember, all of these periods represent name of God. Basically, Pariruz represents what he called Greek metaphysics of putting man at the center, or the arguing that the unknown can be known through we can know the unknown through the known, right? Rationality is basically where it says that man, who we know, can know what is to be known. It is also the beginning of the history of Taghut, Zeus, or Taghut. Right? So Taghut starts with Greek philosophy, and it marks with subjectivism. There is no time to say this. He is almost obsessed with rejecting subject-object dichotomy, right? Because he is for totality. And then the situation gets worse in each period. Right? Renaissance is the height of Taghut. It's a sort of double Taghut, or double Westtoxicated. He uses this term, not that precisely. And then Emruz is the manifestation of nihilism. The false god of the Greek metaphysics is now not even a god, because the man becomes the god. Now, I have to say in parentheses, although I have actually several pages in my paper, that this guy is called like a piece of metal. I don't know what he is deeply and profoundly anti-humanist. He has no tolerance for people who actually live. And he says that, I'm not interpreting this, right? He is so troubled by this idea that man is anything. Because he always, and also said in this period, it is what happens with Descartes and post-Descartian philosophy is that man becomes God, or the claim that man created God. That tainted the Emruz and Farda. Because even Farda is metaphysical. Remember, these epochs are metaphysical. He is trying to reject metaphysical. This is really Heideggerian project. Nothing new, although these Emruz and Farda are very interesting. Past Farda and the day past Farda and Parirus, however, are different. Past Farda is when you had the unity of man and God. His explanation is this, whether it makes sense or not, and there was no oppression, because there was no domination. It was a spiritual relationship. He never actually explains that when was this period of time. Because certainly this was before Greek philosophy. Islam wasn't there, right, as far as we know. So he's not saying that we had the Prophet Muhammad and the Parirus start. No, Parirus is even before the Greek philosophy. Where is Parirus, we don't know. I can say that, well, Hegel or Marx, maybe it's the early commune or something, but he was anti-Marxist. It's not clear. But it is clear that the day after past Farda, is also where there will be no domination or oppression, and that's where man is liberated and we reach the ultimate goal. Now, let me give you examples of what he means by that. This has to do with something else. Now, in trying to describe what is this past Farda, his discussion of past Farda focuses on the issue of violence and sovereignty, right? Which is basically based on Heideggerian theory of ontology. So the Greek philosophy is about naked domination, which is really his critique of instrumental reason. By the way, he also was very much interested in Frankfurt School, since you introduced me as somebody interested in critical theory. Marcuse in particular, he has influence. So he feels that all forms of dominations and violence that are based on rationalism or rationality are illegitimate. Legitimate in the sense that they represent oppression. However, in past Farda, the the domination or leadership is a spiritual domination, is a spiritual violence, if you want to call it that. Because, and again, I don't want to take your time, he goes into this, he said that you have to make a distinction between Wali and Wali. Right? Wali is a spiritual guardianship that he said it manifests in Imam Khomeini's theory of Velayat al-Faqih, and it is, and we have to totally submit to the will of the spiritual leader. So Passover is not very fancy communist utopia, is something that, as he would say, although he contradicts himself a little bit, later he says, well, I was wrong because I thought the Islamic Revolution was the beginning of Passover. Now that I see signs of democracy, I realize that this is not a real revolution. So you see what he's trying to say. So this, he goes on and on this Wali and Wali and how different it is. But basically he says that that in the case of a spiritual leader, all kind of violence is legitimate. He goes into details and discusses that. We don't have time to go into this. This also links to another idea he has that he has written so much about, and that's ilm husuli and ilm husuli, or tafakkur husuli and tafakkur husuli. In English, knowledge and cognition. Knowledge cognition for him is the Enlightenment project. Is science, technological science, scientific worldview. That for him is corrupt and corrupting and represent false God. So he's not for that, and he's for rejecting that. And here is where he is by far more influenced by Heidegger. Heidegger wrote this book, what is called Thinking, which is really, I think it's basically his theory. It's a bad translation of that book. But what is important here is intuition. Although sometimes he says something that comes close to intuition, sometimes comes close to consciousness. Intuition is important because it rejects rationality. It rejects instrumentality. But it invests on the authentic, the beautiful, and what is lovely. And that is in Imam Khomeini's theory of Velayat al-Faqih. So you see that? His theory of politics, based on that 5 periods, and also on this tafakkur husuli wa tafakkur huzuri, what he claims is that he is aestheticizing politics. My pronunciation may not be good. It's basically politics based on beauty. It's politics that is totally distant from people and allows everything, particularly violence, in the name of Mirsepassi. By the way, when Ahmadinejad became president, this was his slogan, Mirsepassi. This Mirsepassi, well, by the way, this is a huge big issue in critical theory and fascism. This is obviously Heidegger, because for Heidegger is not Greek philosophy, analytical thinking, but is poetry. And he does also say, and at the end it is Sheikh. It is Hafiz, although he connects Hafiz and Imam Khomeini and all sorts of things. One more thing, there is another thing about Heidegger that I don't want to go into that. 2 political things. One is that when Shah of Iran announced Hizb al-Astafiz, Fardid became extremely excited. Aghay Narawi tells the story that Fardid goes to Narawi and said that I want to be part of this, part of Hizb al-Astafiz. Narawi, who was somehow close to the regime, said, well, this is stupid. This is one-party system. Why do you want this? He said, this is what we want. We want totality, which actually is consistent. And when during the Shah's regime, they decide to write a manifestation for the Rastakhis' hardy ideology or something, Fardid was one of the writers, or one of the person who participated in that group. In other words, there are all evidence that he was pretty comfortable, particularly during, from my perspective, dark days of the last regime, the Hizb al-Rastakhis. Many of his friends consider him friendly toward Shah. In fact, Aghay Naradi in this interview says that, so when the revolution happened, Fardid called me and said, we did it, and now I'm going to tell you, what's going to happen to you. And I said, what are you talking about? I want to come and see you. And Naradi said that I went to Fardid and I realized that this guy has become a revolutionary Islamicist, and he's telling me that we put you in prison, we kill you, and we do whatever we do. And there are some other actually narratives about this, that people were totally surprised that this guy now has become a sort of pro-revolutionary because of what he said. In fact, he came, I wasn't a student, and I know this, he came, in 2 different periods of times, he participated in debates on TV, mostly against Marxism, but in a sense, he was not critical of that regime. After the revolution, it is also sad, I have almost substantiated this, but it may take 1 more week because apparently I know the person who arranged this meeting and I'm going to meet this person. So that somebody arranged, and it seems that he had a meeting with Aghay Khomeini, although there are some who think that it didn't happen. We don't know. But we know that he was a candidate for Majlis Khofegan. He actually contacted several people, including Aghay Mahajirani, and said that I want to write the constitution. They didn't do that. But he ran for the Majlis Khofegan. How many votes do you think he got? I'm sure that some of you don't know. So he got 200 votes, which is not a lot. In the first Majlis, he was a candidate. And this time he got 6,000 votes. The reason he got 6,000 votes, this is my last comment, is that he was a very close friend of Ayatollah Khalkhali. Sorry. He was actually, and after, well, we also know that he was very, Aghay Khalkhali's son was his student. Aghay Khalkhali's son apparently was a major figure in Fadayan Islam after the revolution. I don't know whether this is true or not. And in fact, Fadayan Islam published something in Kayhan and supported his candidates. So, 2 strange things. One is that for an intellectual philosopher who knows all these languages and has traveled everywhere in the world and and apparently he's not a political person, any moment, whether during the Shah's regime or during this regime, any moment he could get a mediocre kind of political job, he wanted it. But even with the help of Fadayan Islam, he only got 6,000 votes, which is not a lot, right? So this is to say that this is a guy that even people who he supported didn't necessarily and really wanted. If there is time, I want to show these slides. If there is no time, I apologize for taking your time and we'll stop. So these are basically, so he died in 1994. His house became a foundation. I just go, oh my God. So this tells you that I really did hard work, Dr. Milani, and I made all this for Maybe I'm doing... Well, let's just go. These are his libraries. In the libraries, he has 700 books that are in German. This is most of his books. And you see that there are lots of Heidegger, Nietzsche, existentialism kind of book. Popper, well, the only time that he praised Marxism was when somebody asked him about Popper and Avoisirush, and he said that, no, I prefer Marxists to these people. Which he's consistent. He has 400 books that are in French. Well, my student who took this picture a week ago, actually, it is very recent, said that they also have this place that nobody can go, Mahzan. But there are a couple of hundreds of books in Arabic and Farsi. Although, I want to see, if you look at this is the brochure that this foundation, if you look at this, it says that most of the books are about Quran and religious things. This is not true. I have actually a list of all the books. This is a German dictionary. You know, these are different parts of his house. You realize that his house, so they're consistent. You see the kind of books that he reads. I don't have to explain them. There are a couple of tafsir Quran, Quranic interpretations, and there are a couple of Mawlavi's books, and there are some. Now, this is the janitor. This is a little interesting. This is the housekeeper there, who my student said that he also pretends that he's a philosopher, and he insisted that we have to take his pictures. But he is the janitor in that building. But he doesn't look like a janitor from my perspective. And he said, when my student goes there and says what he wanted to do, he said, oh my God, Ustad در امریکا هم محبوبیت دارن. This is his bed. Well, one thing that I haven't said, but there are lots of evidence that he didn't like women that much. He never says anything about his French wife. My friend Ramin Jahanbaglu also said that when they had this party, many of these folks would be there with their wives. Nobody ever saw Fardid's wife. And apparently his mother realized that Fardid would not look at her or other women. And one of his students about this house said that he would not let his wife come downstairs. Yeah, apparently this house is a 3-story house. I'll show you how it is. So his bed was a single bed. This is the story. And he would never let the family to come down. You see that there is a Khomeini and Khomeini's son's picture here. However, my feeling is that this is post-Fardid. I'm not sure if this was there. This guy, Fardid, is the president of the foundation. This is one of his students. What is interesting is that none of Fardid's students are in any way even considered serious scholars, including them. Sorry. These are the same thing. By the way, if you don't notice, you see this little, look like an old woman? She's my graduate student. This is what happened to you if you go to Iran. Particularly if you go here. By the way, she said that they were extremely excited. They didn't care who I was or whether I liked Fardid or not, any attention. Because apparently no one goes there and they get no attention. So these are some of his stuff. Oh. Now, the other thing is that when you look at the house from inside, it looks like a little, middle class kind of house. But in reality, it is not. This is a 4-story house, pretty big, that he had. I tried to see how he was able to purchase this because he was out of work for some time. There was lots of, he has some Arabic book, as you see, Heidegger book on Nietzsche, Heidegger again, and in fact, I do have. So this is the house. This is from south. These are different parts of the house. The claim is that Dr. Siddiqui gave him this house when Dr. Siddiqui was dean of the School of Literature and Philosophy, and Fardid was such an important person, this person who has never written anything, that Dr. Siddiqui, who was a very political person, gave him this house. You have more experience in the academy, in Iranian academy for even like Dr. Zavinkou. This house in Khiyabun Kah, at the time, this was a very nice.
And Sadeghi was never the dean.
But this is what they claim. But the house has maybe 20 rooms or something. In fact, one floor of this is, you don't have the picture of one floor because the Tehran mayor office uses that. It's a huge house. Thank you so much. I hope there is some time for question and answer, but if there isn't, I should be blamed for that. Yes.
You mentioned that when he went to Heidelberg, he had some kind of epiphany or change, but you weren't specific about that, except that he didn't write anything. Did he ever mention what was it that made him change so radically? Did he ever talk about what was it that brought about this?
No, he never says that. He does say that I was a fanatically pro-Western person. The trip to Europe in general, he doesn't even say whether Germany and France changed me. He does also say that I became Hamsokhan, a speech partner of Heidegger. Now, the real question is that when did he get to know Heidegger? Right? Now, so he wrote from Kant to Heidegger very early when he was in Iran. We know that he had relationship with Henry Corbin. Henry Corbin is the guy who introduced Heidegger to France, right? Translated 3 of his books. And Fardid actually, with the help of someone else, I'm sure that this another person did most of the book, very early on, before he went to France, translated a book by Corbin on Zoroastrian influence of Shiism. I actually have that book. And Corbin actually complained because he never, it took several years. Now, some people argue that it was through Corbin that he was converted into this Islamism. The evidence I have, it shows that before he got to know Corbin, he was writing about Heidegger. So it's an enigma, as Dr. Milani said. No, he doesn't even say that whether he met Heidegger or not. We actually don't know what he did. He doesn't say that, vaguely speaking, this is what I did.
So what is the evidence that he changed?
Well, he does say, he changed because the quote from Hidayat said that he was a fanatically pro-Western person, that we know. He wrote in the earlier writing, it's all about Western philosophy, although in his later teachings, principles at Tehran University, he always offered courses on modern Western philosophy. He never thought about Islamic philosophy. He does say that the trips to Europe changed because of it. But his writings also changed. He began writing about Islam, and this past tomorrow, yesterday, these whole things, and the concept of Westtoxicated. I didn't get into that. he came up with this notion in 1956 or 8. These are all post.
To paraphrase, that Western philosophy is toxic somehow? West toxic.
No, he thinks it is. But what I'm trying to say is that at the same time that his obsession was with the same thing that he rejected. Or he blamed others for it.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I actually have two questions.
Sure.
One is the people that they used to go to these meetings. When you interviewed them and your students did, how come they didn't say anything substantial? Because they didn't want to say, or it wasn't anything substantial in the meetings? That's number one. Number two is, listening to you, I still am confused. Are you pro him or against him or what?
I think actually the two questions are related. And this is not my opinion. I feel something deep and profound is going on here. That when people who spend 20 years with Fardid and praise him are not willing to say that he did that, we were wrong, let's move on. They are trying to say that either we knew from the beginning that he was stupid, or we were not there. My conclusion is that, let me tell you this. There is a book that, this book was just published in the US called American Nietzsche. Anybody has seen the book? It's actually has become a popular book in the academy. There is a chapter in this book where the author says, Nietzsche is us. I think, and I know that some of you may get upset with me on this, in some respect, Fardid is us. It's like the Iranian Revolution. I was in Iran during the Iranian Revolution. Millions and millions and millions and millions of people participated. I can't find anyone these days who ever participated in that. Everybody rejected that. Or everybody said, I was there to observe. Including my mother, who I have to say that, Mother, you were there just to observe? He said, yes, I wouldn't be with this type of aha. Michael Fisher has written something about this that is revealing, and that is that, the ability of sometimes to withhold information. I have talked to people who are outside of Iran, and my students have talked to people who are in Iran, and I have not so far found a single person who is willing to say that I thought Fardid was a complicated, very smart philosopher of the time. I agreed with him. I don't agree with him now. There is nothing wrong with saying that. Nobody is willing to say that. I think it is because it's part of their own identity. Remember, again, I try to say this. I don't want to say more. And whether I'm pro this or not, I think my entire intellectual life project is to, from my perspective, to tell the sad story of how intellectuals can be so brutal and violent and betray their own people. I think this is only one of them. But I don't want to say that Fardid is an exception. I do not believe that. I'm not trying to say that all Iranian intellectuals are like Fardid.
But I think, while there is definitely some of Fardid in every Iranian, I think the majority of Iranian intellectuals have a much better record. Fardid was a political, I think, committee. He sold his reason to the highest bidder. If you listen to his interviews, I went to his classes when he taught at Tehran University. I thought that he was an absolute political harlot. There's no other word for it. He would sell his reason to justify Westtoxicated, and 3 years later, because he was worried about his earnings, worried about his retirement fund, he would convene classes for the Hezbollah at Tehran University and would tag everybody from Zaryankul to Surush as Masonic Jewish poison that has poisoned these walls and incited the students. I was in the room where he was inciting students to go against Zaryankul, to go against Sadiq, to go against Surush. That kind of a harlotry is not common to every Iranian intellectual. I would disagree.
No, I think there must be a misunderstanding. My comment was not about post-revolution Iran. Obviously, Fardid at this time did not have eminent Iranian intellectuals around him. But I'm talking about the 60s and 70s. That wasn't true. He was almost not all, but almost every Iranian intellectuals have a relationship. And I have mentioned some, I can mention others, and have praised him. Babar Parham is the only person that I know that wrote something mildly critical, and mostly on the fact that it's hard to understand. So there is no, in post-revolutionary, yes, it is true now, for instance, there are lots of accusations that I have not been able to substantiate in his involvement with Pastor, Samaj Pastor, Revolutionary Guards and other things. No, he became totally isolated. But my reference is to him in the 60s and 70s. Aghay Mahdavi, we have evidence from Dawishi Sharigan, and these are really the elite of the elites of Iranian intellectuals, right? Who were his friends and associates, right? In fact, Aghay Naraghi claims credit for going and seeing everyone to make sure that he is considered a PhD and get a job. He does these strange acts that are not typical in Iranian intellectuals, right? So Naraghi said that there is this meeting in Faculty of Social Sciences, and a French philosopher, Lefebvre or someone, is talking, and then he interrupts him. He basically interrupts the meetings and basically forces everyone to go home. He does this kind of thing, but then Naraghi invites him back. What I want to say is that, Fardid's criticism perhaps is partly your criticism of Naraghi too, has to be. Otherwise, we are not taking any responsibility for anything. Is that we don't know who made this revolution? We were not that, we were all critical. These people come from Palestine or Turkey or someone, and none of the people who rule Iran are Iranians. I think there is something profound going on, from my perspective, although these are my opinions, not based on any facts. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yes, I was wondering if in your research you have found any reference between Fardid and Ustad Elahi.
You have to tell me who Ustad Elahi is.
You were talking about how he was kind of pushing away the Sufis.
Oh, okay.
And of course, Ustad Elahi is a Sufi. And I was wondering if there was any connection.
No, I don't know. I have no idea. Well, he thinks that, not obviously, in those Fardidian meetings, he tells people that Hafiz is basically a Heideggerian poet, and apparently had theories that some people took it seriously, some people didn't take it seriously. In some of his lectures or the writings that we have, he sometimes goes into mysticism. But in his theory of historical time and violence and sovereignty, he actually is brutal against mysticism or Sufism. And for instance, the relationship between Murid and Murad, he thinks that's false, that's also creation of God, false God. And so I think he's ambivalent probably. But I don't know Aghay Elahi to even say anything. And he has Masnavi book that you read his writings, there is this sort of mystic tone, but it's more, in my book that Dr. Milani reviewed, I have a long chapter, 70-page on Heidegger. I have to say that Heidegger obviously is German, is probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century. I'm not comparing them. But there is this mystical tone in Heidegger as well. Sometimes is shockingly brilliant, but still you don't know what this guy is saying. In fact, there are several books on Heidegger saying that this is an intellectual charlatan. And what we think he means, he doesn't mean. So I want to tell you also that Fardid is not that unique. There are others in the Western context who feel that. And there are others who think that despite all his collaboration with Nazi Germany, Heidegger represents the finest moment of Western philosophy. So you have this in other places. There is no questions? Thank you so much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.